session. We have several items on our agenda. I'm going to call us to order. It appears that everyone is here. I'll ask the clerk to call roll.
Yes, Mr. Mayor. Councilmember Lee.
Here.
Councilmember Pappen.
Here.
Councilmember Bonilla.
Here.
Deputy Mayor Rodriguez.
Here.
Mayor Goethals.
Here.
Thank you.
Looking at our agenda, it looks like on our study session, the first of 3 items is the downtown parking and enforcement update. Do we have a presentation?
We do. One moment, please.
Hi, Sue Ellen. Welcome.
Hi. Thank you.
I neglected to mention at the beginning of the meeting that today is my daughter's 10th birthday. So happy birthday to Ellie at home. I wish I was with you right now.
10 years. Yes.
Go ahead, Sue Ellen.
Happy birthday to your daughter. Good evening, Mayor Goethals and City Council members. Sue Ellen Atkinson. I'm the Principal Transportation Planner in Public Works, and I'm here tonight presenting downtown parking and enforcement update. I'd like to mention that this presentation, the report is a joint effort of the Public Works Department, Police Department, and Finance Department. And we do have staff here from all departments available for questions on this item. So an overview of what we intend to cover in this study session, a broad overview of the Downtown Parking and Security Fund, which is Fund 28, and general revenues and expenditures for that fund. Current revenue during this COVID-19 pandemic timeframe, the projected fund balance for the upcoming 2020 to 2021 fiscal year, and then options for council consideration. So first off, I wanted to go into a brief overview on the general revenue sources for Fund 28. As you can see, the revenue sources come from a number of locations, sources rather. The largest being parking meter revenue and parking permits. Both are for our paid parking environment in our downtown. In total, 85% of our revenue into Fund 28 comes from those 2 sources. In fiscal year 2018 to 2019, the revenue into Fund 28 was about $4.4 million. The current estimated revenue into Fund 28 for our current fiscal year 1920 is $3.1 million. Moving forward, what do we spend the funds in Fund 28 on? As you can see, they also are across a broad variety of departments within the city, economic development, current planning for this fiscal year only, parking operations, downtown facilities maintenance, security, and parking enforcement. A number of those expenditure areas do include staff time and program costs. For example, facilities maintenance includes staffing and our downtown cleaning contract. Parking enforcement funds the community service officers who oversee vehicle abatement, which is our 72-hour abandoned vehicle parking, and also our contract parking enforcement. So just another view of the employees that are funded out of Fund 28. In total, for the community service and abandoned vehicles, that's 3 FTEs. Parking and transportation staff is just over 2 FTEs. So this just gives you an idea of what the revenue in Fund 28 goes toward. This is a little bit stunning to see the change in the downtown parking revenue from April 2019 to April 2020. When the shelter-in-place order went into effect and starting on April 7th, parking enforcement in our downtown was halted. However, we did not fully disable the paid parking environment. So meter collection and meter maintenance continued, albeit at a much reduced frequency. So in April 2019, we're seeing $235,000 in monthly parking revenue from our meters, pay stations, pay by phone, and our monthly parking permits. And in April 2020, we've just seen $31,000 in revenue. So striking contrast between the 2 years. While Our paid parking revenue through meters and pay stations has drastically declined. There was information about the halt in parking enforcement that was communicated out, information that paying while you're in downtown if you were running errands to essential businesses, et cetera, was not necessary. We did continue our monthly permit program. We made a change in policy that offered a full refund for the month for those who did not need to drive to downtown for their work, but wanted the option of maintaining their permit for the next month. Our typical policy is if you want to get a refund for the permit, your permit is canceled and you join a wait list. But during this time period, we issued the refund for the full month and users were able to maintain their permits. In total, in March and April, 250 permit refunds were issued at request. That's about 1,400 permits that we issued. So in looking at the revenue and expenditures from Fund 28 and the understandable dip in revenue in Fund 28, we looked forward to the upcoming 2021 projected fund balance for that Fund 28. There were several assumptions that were taken into account when the proposed operating budget for Fund 28 was created. First, there was an assumption of a transfer from the general fund in the amount of $1.1 million. And that was assuming full implementation of the contract parking enforcement efforts. So earlier this year, parking enforcement was contracted out to an exterior company, and the full implementation assumed that there would be far more parking enforcement personnel throughout the city. So that $1.1 million transfer was contingent on full implementation of that program. With the COVID-19 situation at hand, parking enforcement had implemented up to the point of 8 out of the expected 10 personnel being deployed throughout the city, and since then has ramped back down. Further, the estimated operating budget for Fund 28 in the next fiscal year was estimated at $4.6 million. And then that budget also assumes a $1.6 million transfer from Fund 28 to the CIP budget for improvements at the Central Park Garage. And I'll just go into those a little bit. I have some photos here. Public Works had a structural engineering firm conduct an assessment of our garage underneath the tennis courts at Central Park. The $1.6 million project is planned in an effort to waterproof the upper deck, to provide structural stabilization to extend the useful life of the garage about 10 years. The reconstruction of this garage has been planned out in the Central Park Master Plan. So the efforts for this project were to remedy structural issues that were found during that assessment and to make the garage structurally sound for 10 years. And then in that time frame, the expectation is that we would be able to fund the parking garage reconstruction project at that location. So the risk of not moving forward with this project is that there may be further deterioration in the garage, and that would require garage closure if it's not safe for people to be in. That would lose 121 parking spaces in our downtown, and we don't have any way to quantify when that might happen. So just a little bit of background on that project for your knowledge and moving forward in this item. So in looking at the projected fund balance for Fund 28 in the next fiscal year, we ran some calculations to figure out if the current environment in the downtown continues where there's no parking enforcement and no paid parking, how long could we fund the operating expenses in Fund 28? And what we found was that we could fund the operating expenses for 2 months, including funding that CIP commitment of $1.6 million transferred out. And then we started trying different alternatives. So if the general fund transfer of $1.1 million were made regardless of the status of parking enforcement in the city, we would be able to fund Fund 28 for 6 months, including that CIP commitment. In order to fully fund for the whole for the whole fiscal year, we would require $2.4 million transferred over. And then finally, we looked at what would happen if we eliminated the transfer to the CIP project for the Central Park Garage. If that were to take place, or if that were eliminated rather, we could fund 8 months of the operating expenses. Additionally, $800,000 would be needed on top of that elimination to fully fund the operating expenses. I do want to note that project, there have not been any other sources that have been identified for funding for that project. We delved into the operating budget a little bit further to determine at what point would we need to start enforcement and paid parking in the downtown in order to fund our operating budget coming out of Fund 28. So that would be the full funding of operations, the capital improvement project commitment of $1.6 million. And we found that starting parking enforcement and paid parking in the downtown no later than August 1st was required to fund the full 12 months of the budget. That would assume a 30-day warning and communication period ahead of time so that we can let people know paid parking is expected and parking enforcement will be taking place. We also looked through a number of other options, including starting parking enforcement later, and the estimated funding timeframes based on the starting month of enforcement are shown on this slide. So for example, if starting enforcement were delayed until September, we could fund 11 months of the operating budget. So that brings us to the options for council consideration during this study session. The first option, of course, is to continue the suspension of parking enforcement and paid parking in the downtown. If that were the council direction this evening, then staff would take measures to fully close paid parking in the downtown and bag all of the meters and turn off the pay stations to eliminate the need for collections and maintenance during this time. The second option is to remove the $1.6 million CIP fund transfer for the Central Park parking garage. And again, an alternate funding source has not been identified for that project, so it would likely be pushed to another year. And then the third option would be to begin downtown parking enforcement and paid parking. Staff recommendation is to begin a 30-day communication and warning period immediately, given the recent shelter-in-place order modifications that allow dining outside. So there is more active use of our downtown at this time. With that 30 days, it's expected that parking enforcement would begin around July 15th. Which is a Wednesday. So if we wanted to start it on a Monday, it would be July 13th. And that would follow that warning time frame. So of these options, the staff recommendation is option 3 in order to fully fund our CIP commitment for this year and to fully fund our operating expenses out of Fund 28. So for this evening, the discussion items, first is council feedback and direction on refunds for our monthly parking permit program. As I mentioned, we're currently issuing refunds by request, full refunds, and the users who are getting refunds are able to maintain their permit for the next month. Typical operating procedure is that we would issue the refund and the permit would be canceled, so they would go back on a wait list. Staff recommendation is to issue refunds by request through June and then begin standard issuance with our cancellation policy beginning in July. And then we also request council direction for next steps on parking enforcement and paid parking operations in the downtown. And that completes my presentation. As I mentioned, we have staff from the police department and finance department who are available for more specific questions. And thank you for your time.
Sue Ellen, thank you so much for a great presentation. Any questions from the council? I don't see any questions at this time. Any public comment? Double check here. I'm going to look to see if any of our attendees have their hands raised and would like to speak on this item. And I'm looking through, we have about 20 attendees right now, and I don't see any of them with their hands raised. So I'll bring it back to the council. And Sue Ellen, you mentioned the three recommendations. Sue Ellen is part of
the staff recommendation.
I just had one question. Thank you, Diane.
Sorry?
Just one quick question, and that's for the monthly pass holders with regards to their July fees. Is it prorated or not prorated?
That would be at council direction. The staff recommendation would be to begin our standard cancellation refund policy starting July 1. If council directs to do prorated refunds through the middle of July, then we can certainly do that. And we do have that available within our permit system.
I guess I was looking at it two different ways. One way would be that the permit for July would essentially be half the cost since we're only enforcing for half the month. So it wouldn't have to be refunded. It would just, okay, for those people who are seeking a pass for the month of July, it would cost half as much.
If that's council direction, then we can make that work, yes.
Is there a feeling on the council? I can go either way. Rick, you have a comment? Go ahead, Rick.
Sure. I agree that we should start refunds, and I think what the mayor just suggested sounds like a suitable response to provide refunds to our monthly parkers. Also, I support the recommendation 3, which I think will get us moving in the right path regarding parking and enforcement. I do think we need to start charging for parking as soon as possible. And I think at the same time, we need to bring back enforcement. But I would like to offer an alternative, which is because we're going to have food uses on the streets, parking areas, sidewalks, whatever, maybe we'll shut a street down. I think we're going to discuss that later. But I think we need to offer the garages free parking. Street parking paid for and enforced, garages, structures, free. So I think that's an alternative we should consider. And other than that, I think I stated my thoughts. Thank you.
Eric, you have comments?
Yeah, I was just curious of staff's response to that suggestion by Councilmember Bonilla.
I'll take that. I'll start, Sue, and you can, because I know you've been working on some of the parking closing. So I think Councilmember Bonilla, if we were to do that, I think it would have continue to have a pretty significant effect on our revenues, because we are going to be losing a lot of the street parking and pushing folks into the garages so we can get the restaurants out into the public right of way. So I think if we made the garages free, we would still have a pretty significant revenue problem.
Okay.
I think I understand. Thank you.
Any other comments from council?
I wanted to make a comment just about the need to have really robust communication throughout this month. We've gotten a lot of feedback recently about parking enforcement and really wanting to just encourage us to double down on the communication so that this does not catch anyone by surprise, and as much as possible really leverage all the work that's been done to connect with the businesses about this change in enforcement.
Yeah, Councilmember Lee, this is Brad Underwood, Public Works Director. We will definitely do that. We've already had some discussions about the need for that. So we'll put the team, depending on the direction tonight, and work on that right away.
Thanks, Brad. I don't see any other. Oh, Eric, you had another comment.
Just say I support staff's recommendation on both items.
Number 3, and then Eric, does that mean you want pass holders to pay for the full month of July?
I could go either way, but I would say yes if it was up to me, but I can go either way.
Okay. Any other input?
Well, I just have a question. What does that do to, you had indicated that if you start in July, you can meet your bills for a year. If you do the prorated, will you still be able to meet your bills for a year? So Ellen.
The estimate was based on starting no later than August 1st. So if we prorate in July, we could. It depends on council direction.
Okay. Well, I think it seems reasonable to prorate.
Yeah, I I'm just imagining the people who are signing up for a pass, and they're only getting the benefit for half the month. I think when we can, we should be as fair as possible and give people what they're paying for. I'll make it my my motion that we go with recommendation number 3, and then also issue the refunds for June, and whether you're going to issue half as a refund or you're going to issue a permit that only costs half as much for the month of July, either way is fine with me.
I'll second that.
Motion is second. Please respond to the clerk.
Excuse me. Mayor Gothels,
Yes.
Deputy Mayor Rodriguez,
Yes.
Councilmember Bonilla,
Yes.
Councilmember Pappen,
Yes.
Councilmember Lee.
Yes.
That passes unanimously. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Sue Ellen, for
Thank you very much.
the presentation. On to our second item on our agenda, which is November 3rd, 2020, general municipal election, calling the election and placing a city council proposition on the ballot. I see Sean Mason. Is there a presentation on this item?
Yes, there is, Mr. Mayor. Do you see my
Not yet.
sharing? How about now?
There it is.
Great. So thank you, Mr. Mayor and members of the council. The purpose of this agenda item is to provide the opportunity for the City Council to discuss and decide whether it wishes to place a ballot measure on the November 2020 ballot. This presentation will be made in 2 parts. I will be presenting on the history and context in which this decision is being considered, and CDD Director Kojayan will be presenting on the impacts of the proposed ballot measure on a general plan update process. So under the existing general plan, it contains limits on building heights and intensities, and some affordable housing policies that were originally adopted by the voters in 1991 in Measure H, and then extended by the voters in 2004 by Measure P. Under the terms of Measure P, the provisions will expire at the end of 2020. In 2018, San Mateans for Responsive Government gathered sufficient signatures to qualify a ballot measure to extend the Measure P sunset date to the end of 2030. Following action of the council at its May meeting, the SMRG measure will appear in the November 2020 ballot. In February 2020, proponents of an alternative measure notified the city that they would be gathering signatures to qualify an alternative measure to be submitted to the voters in November. In March 2020, the San Mateo County Health Officer issued shelter-in-place orders in response to the coronavirus pandemic. These orders have prevented the proponents of the alternative measure from obtaining signatures for their petition. On June 1, the proponents requested that the City Council exercise their authority under state law to place their measure on the November ballot. In response to this request, the City Council directed staff to place this item on tonight's agenda. The text of the next 2 slides highlights the features of the proposed alternative measure. First, like the SMRG measure, it has a 10-year term, that is, extends to the end of 2030. The measure would freeze height and intensity limits throughout the community, except for designated areas in the vicinity of San Mateo's 3 Caltrain stations. And the measure would authorize City Council to increase height and intensity limits in these areas after completing its general plan update process. In addition, the measure would authorize the City Council to provide alternatives to BMR units, including in lieu fees, and would provide that a project that complies with the inclusionary housing requirements may be developed at the maximum height and building intensity limits without providing public benefits beyond code requirements. Before turning over the presentation to Director Kojayan, I'd like to describe feedback I received today from a member of the public about the text of the ballot question as it is written in the resolution in your packet. The first few lines of the text of the ballot question in the resolution follows very closely the language of the question for the SMRG ballot initiative. The concern was expressed that this could lead to voter confusion that would be of no benefit to the supporters of either measure. The suggestion was made to place the text granting the City Council authority to enact higher heights and densities first in the order of actions the proposed measure would enact. This slide depicts how the revised text would appear on the ballot. The italicized text would not be italicized on the ballot, but it's here to show what was moved. At the conclusion of Director Kojayan's presentation, staff will be seeking council direction on these questions. That concludes my presentation. I will stop sharing and turn it over to Kohar.
Thank you, Sean. Welcome, Kohar.
Hello, good evening. Do you see my screen?
Not yet.
Okay. Let's see, what did I do wrong?
There it is.
All right, excellent. Good evening, Mayor Goethals and members of the council. As outlined in your staff report, there are some general plan update implications of the alternative ballot measure. If passed, the measure would require some significant retooling of our land use draft alternatives that we have been working on and received thousands of inputs and viewpoints from our community and residents on. But just to be clear that an extension of Measure P would have even more implications, this report and summary is just outlining the implications of this proposed alternative measure, not the extension of Measure P. So as you can see on the screen in front of you, the black outlined areas are our 10 study areas. The areas that are hatched in red are the boundaries of the proposed alternative ballot measure exception areas. They are closely aligned. However, a significant portion of our study areas are not included in the alternative measure. Study areas 3, 4, and 5. So 3 of our areas that were identified by our community during our general plan update process are mostly included. There's some small areas that are not included. However, there are significant portions such as Bridgepoint, Laurelwood, and then other areas, as you can see here, and a majority of El Camino that was included in our study areas, which are not part of the alternative measure. So I just wanted to quickly go over some pros and cons. There are some pros. The ballot measure does represent a compromise between 2 of our draft alternatives, alternatives A and B, which focuses a majority of growth near the transit corridor. So if the ballot alternative measure is on the ballot and it passes, I could see there being some alignment with the viewpoint shared by our residents through our general plan update process, which is including more heights and densities in the transit corridor and then not including those densities and heights outside of that area. And although it doesn't align exactly with the alternatives, as I mentioned, it does align pretty closely with most of the areas in the transit corridor and most of the areas where we assumed high density mixed use. And also it does exclude single family parcels. Those have been carved out, which is consistent with the study areas outlined within our general plan update process. Some of the cons just to consider: the general plan, through the general plan alternatives process and the update process, we've received over 4,000 comments and viewpoints from residents and community members. These proposed boundaries within the alternative ballot measure don't represent viewpoints of those who wanted us to consider potential growth and change outside of the red hatched areas. That the ballot measure as proposed does exclude approximately 88% of what we assume would be high density office growth. This could mean that we would have to rethink what that means for the future job growth in San Mateo and where we would propose to grow or not grow. And the areas that we were expecting some growth in terms of jobs and office uses were at the Bridgepoint Shopping Center near the 92-101 corridors. So we would have to just retool and rethink what that means for the general plan update and the future of San Mateo. And then the last thing, which is a significant, I think, a con, is about 43% of our high residential growth areas are outside of the red hatched boundaries. What this means, what this could mean, depending on what happens with our RHNA allocation, which is the Regional Housing Needs allocation that the city is obligated to comply with and plan for growth. If that number comes back at a high level, we might have to rezone and change land uses in some of these low residential areas to more medium residential areas in order to balance the loss of high residential options. So those are just some of the pros and cons. I'm available to answer any questions, but this was just to provide kind of a high level overview. Thanks.
Thank you, Kohar. Any questions from the council at this point before we go to public comment? I don't see questions from the council at this point. I do show that we have quite a few participants. Within the attendees, I see 4 hands raised at the moment, and I'm sure we'll have more hands raised for public comment on this item. I'm going to start with the person listed as Martin. You can unmute yourself, Martin. I'm going to ask that everyone keep it to 2 minutes. When there's 10 seconds left, I will let you know to wrap it up. And Martin, you can start now. Mr. Mancini?
I didn't mean to raise my hand. I apologize. You can move on to the next person.
No problem. Thank you. Roseann Faust, you're next.
Mayor Goethals and members of the council, thank you very much for allowing me to speak this evening. I submitted a letter on behalf of the San Mateo County Economic Development Association, SAMCEDA, actually in support of your consideration for the alternative ballot measure. I really appreciate everything that you all have done these last few months during the pandemic. I also appreciate all that you've done for the community in its entirety for housing opportunities. And I think that the alternative ballot measure allows you greater flexibility within the confines of the continuing general plan process. Our organization did vote to oppose the extension of Measure P because it is a different time and place from when that was passed many years ago. So we really encourage you to look throughout the community of San Mateo to allow yourselves the flexibility to have housing for all those who need it without entering into the single family residential zones. So thank you very much for allowing me the opportunity to speak. Thank you for all that you are doing and continue to do for our community, for our businesses and our residents. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roseann. Moving on to our next public comment, Lester Chen.
Thank you, Mayor Goethals, honorable members of City Council, esteemed staff. I just had a thought for your consideration. Given the wide-ranging impacts of this ballot measure, perhaps the threshold should be 55% to pass, sort of following the parcel tax threshold. So just an idea to float out there for your consideration. Thank you for giving me the time.
Thank you, Lester Chen. Moving on to Evelyn Stivers. Evie?
Hello, thank you for the opportunity to speak. My name is Evelyn Stivers. I'm the Executive Director of Housing Leadership Council of San Mateo County. We work with communities and their leaders to create and preserve quality, affordable homes. I really appreciate the work that the staff has done on in this just crazy, unprecedented time on the alternative ballot measure. I do think it's really important for the council to have a measure that allows for us to meet our housing needs, but that is responsive to the community call for protecting single-family neighborhoods. I find that language really gut-wrenchingly ugly. I think we are a much more inclusive community than that, and I don't think that that is the way forward. But I do think that having the ballot measure P be the only measure on the ballot is super risky for the city. I think it's not just bad public policy, it's really poorly written. It's really just a terrible direction for the city to continue going on. So thank you for your leadership on this. And I really liked the inclusion of Bridgepoint and other areas in the measure. So important during our economic times. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Stivers. Next, we have retired Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Weissmiller. Go ahead, Colonel Weissmiller.
Mayor Godels, members of the City Council, City Manager Corbett, and City Attorney Mason, thank you for your service to the city. I'm opposed to the City Council putting a $200,000 bill on the table to pay for putting this measure on the November ballot. Whenever you put a bill on the table, there must be a bill payer. The bill payer is cuts in services and/or reductions in employees. I watched the City Council meeting on June 1st. The Finance Director gave a sobering report on the condition of the city budget. Based on the facial expressions of the City Council members and their comments, our city is in a desperate financial situation. COVID-19 crippled the budget. Revenues have dropped and difficult decisions will have to be made. It does not make sense to me to put this bill on the table, especially when we are wrestling with the uncertainty of future pandemic problems. I urge members of the council to reverse their dispositions and vote no. Thank you.
Colonel Weissmiller, thank you for your service and your public comment. Michael Weiner.
Good evening, Mayor and the members of the council. My name is Mike Weinhauer. I'm the spokesperson for San Mateans for Responsive Government. We have sent the council a longer statement on our position posted to our website, smartergrowthsm.com. Let me hit some of the highlights for emphasis. San Mateans for Responsive Government respectfully comes before you as active community members who strongly believe in our democratic rights to hold our elected officials accountable to the voters they serve. We make our statement because we believe the public is entitled to understand what is happening here. We believe that agreeing to do what you are being asked to do tonight is just wrong. This is an ethical line that should not be crossed, yet it provides a clear example of just how much money talks in politics. Asking the council to do what this developer real estate group couldn't do for themselves and what this council refused to do for the Measure P supporters is exactly why Measures H and P were written and approved twice by the voters. What kind of trust are your constituents and the 7,000 plus voters who signed our petition supposed to have when they followed the rules? Yet at the last minute, this council decides to put a competing measure, despite our opponents having ample time since council voted to put our measure on the ballot in September 2019. It is not fair, it is wrong, but clearly money talks. Who's really behind the measure these three proponents are asking you to put on the ballot, and why isn't their affiliation clearly identified? According to the FPPC legal filing, the Bohannon Company, owners of Hillsdale Mall and adjacent properties, has already contributed $200,000 to their self-controlled committee to pass this measure. This is the equivalent of between 2,000 and 10,000 grassroots donations. That's more than putting your finger on the scale. It's taking a seat on it. But should we be surprised? No, indeed, because money talks. If the proponents of this competing measure want to replace Measure P, let them do the hard work to place their measure on the ballot in 2022. The council has promised no changes will be made to the GP until it is updated, which is well after that date. There is no compelling reason for this competing measure to be placed on the ballot at this time, unless, of course, money talks. Again, with the limited time the public is given, we ask the public to please go to our website, smartergrowthsm.com, for our full remarks. Thank you.
Michael, would you allow me, you made a comment about the date. What was the date that you said?
September 9th, 2019 was when this council, per my recollection, put this on, voted to put it on.
Or were you saying, okay, sorry, I thought you were saying something else. Thank you for your public comment, Michael. I'm looking for other hands. Would any of the other attendees like to speak? I see two more. Tim Frank. Go ahead, Tim Frank.
I just unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, terrific. Thank you. I appreciate the work that you all are doing here. I think it's really important. Just by way of introduction, I'm Tim Frank, and I'm the executive director of the Center for Sustainable Neighborhoods. And we seek to promote projects and policies that help make neighborhoods more sustainable throughout the city, the state of California, and are particularly interested in the areas that are most impacted by the challenges of climate change and traffic, et cetera. And San Mateo is an example of that, with an extreme housing crisis, within a huge in-commute population, et cetera. And we think that the voters of San Mateo, who have been asked for too long to make a false choice between protecting their residential neighborhoods and addressing climate change and having a vital downtown, we think that they should have a better choice, and that the council has an opportunity to now present them with a choice so that they can actually choose both to protect their residential neighborhoods and to plan for a more sustainable downtown that actually provides more housing opportunities, that has the flexibility to structure its affordable housing programs to provide deeper affordability. And we think actually to create a better quality of life for the residents of San Mateo. And putting the measure that the council is working on the ballot would provide the voters with the opportunity to make a choice to protect their neighborhoods that doesn't actually have to give up these positive values. So we encourage your work on this and think it's the right thing to do. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your public comment. Drew.
Hello there. Good evening, Council. This is Drew from many of the meetings in the past. So for me, I'm really struggling with this measure in the sense that I'm open to potentially increase densities, heights, and a variety of things to do things smart. But when I look at the borders of this, and I keep hearing the comments about, well, it's around stations. And then I look at the borders around stations. And then I look how neighborhoods are excluded. Or I look how, like, north of downtown, along North San Mateo Avenue, that area is included, but other areas aren't. And then I hear some of the speakers talk about, well, we're protecting our residential areas. And then I look at what's happened in Minneapolis and across the country and about white privilege and stuff. And I'm like, all this is to me is some coded thing. I'm okay potentially long-term making changes, and I would vote for that. But I'm like, why? We're protecting, there's like these code words were being said. And I'm like, isn't that what all the demonstrations are about? Is how we're going to be more inviting and more understanding of other cultures and other environments. And I look at the boundaries don't do that. The boundaries are very linearly defined by property zoning and stuff. And I go, okay, why? How does that fit in? And then I'm like, why does it have to be the council puts this on? It could be, they can go for 2022, and then they can override measure H or P or whatever if it passes this November. I'm just struggling with how this process suddenly gets there. And I know there's sausage making in this whole thing, but I think I represent, there's some of us in the middle, we're open to some stuff. And I'm just like, I'm really struggling with how this is kind of coming about right now. Thank you.
Thanks, Drew. Thank you for that public comment. Martin. If anyone else would like to speak after Martin, please raise your hand now. Otherwise, Martin is going to be our last speaker.
You can hear me now? Thank you.
Yes.
As a San Mateo homeowner who's aware of the need for more housing and, importantly, more affordable housing, I think we need to consider rolling back the height limit in some way to make it easier to welcome more people into San Mateo and to provide more opportunities for affordable housing. Allowing higher and denser development in transit-rich areas is a good start. It's not alone sufficient, but a good start. Because the alternative measure, as I read it, seems to support this, I support the alternative measure, and as such, I support it being put on the ballot. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have another hand, H. Hewitt. H. Hewitt.
Hello.
Welcome.
Thank you. I just wanted it to be said that there is a lot of
construction currently ongoing that has no problem keeping under the Measure P all of Station Park Green and the potential coming up with the passages and the AAA building, as it's referred to, all in that area. And I don't really see a whole lot of need for supporting your putting this on any ballot in the future. I think it, as it was said, it should wait to see what happens with Measure P in November. And we all know you've already said that you are against it. So that's all I needed to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your public comment. Last call for public comment. Any attendees who would like to speak, raise your hand at this time. Seeing none, I'll close the public comment period. Oh, one more. Robin. Robin.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Sorry, I threw my hand up at the last minute. I just wanted to say that I was one of the people that went out and gathered signatures for Measure P, and I'm going to be really appalled that the City Council doesn't put it on the measure. I talked to many citizens in San Mateo who were in favor of extending the height limits with Measure P. I'm also a little shocked that given the pandemic and the ways that it's going to impact how we think about housing, how we think about work, that we're going to be moving forward with kind of the same, going forward with the dense housing. And so I really, hope that you will put our original ballot measure on the ballot this November. I think, as Michael said, there's time for the alternative measure in 2022. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Robin. And I'll just take this time to clarify. Measure P, as it was written by the proponents, will appear on the ballot, and we're considering placing another measure on the ballot, different, but with the maps that we just talked about. So Measure P will also be on the ballot, but then now we're considering this other measure that started to gather signatures earlier this year. I see no other hands. Is there anyone else who would like to speak on this item? Seeing none, I'll bring it back to the council for discussion. What if we start with the maps first? Is there any of the areas outside of the current areas in red that anyone feels should be considered? Councilmember Lee.
I wanted to raise a couple of questions just for the public benefit. There are a couple of things I feel like should deserve some clarification. Directed at Sean, is it not the case that that Measure P in 2004 was placed on the ballot by the council?
That's correct.
Okay, so there is a precedent for measures being placed on the ballot without signature gathering for Measure P.
That's correct.
Okay, and just for Rich, our financial director, do we have a breakdown of what the difference between cost is to the city for a special election in 2022 versus a consolidated election in 2020?
Should we redirect that to the city clerk, to Patrice Old?
Okay.
Oh, you're still muted. But if you could tell us if the number of people in the election matters and which one costs more. Still muted. Sorry.
Now can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So I wanted to clarify one thing first. There is a comment, don't place this ballot measure on because it's going to cost $200,000. The $200,000 range is for doing all of our election. It's the guesstimate from the county elections office, and it's for the candidate election we're having. It's for the ballot measure that's already on there, the extension of Measure P, and it just adds to add this cost on. for adding another ballot measure is estimated around 16 to 18,000 in addition to what we've already have committed to spending, because we are having an election this November. This is our regular election. We are sharing costs with almost all 20 cities and additional special districts in November 3rd. And so that cost sharing works to the city's benefit. If we do a special election in an off year, it can cost us significantly more, about 3 times as much.
Can I ask a clarifying question? So you're saying that the net additional cost of an additional ballot measure is between $16,000 and $18,000, and you're saying
that's the estimate from the county elections office. It depends on the number of pages, printing costs, and a few other things.
And then by comparison, having a single ballot measure on the 2022 ballot would be 3 times more of that net base of 16 to 18,000.
Yeah. Oh yes, and additional costs onto that, because we still have to roll out the polling places and do all the printing for mailing the ballots and so on too. When we held in 2017 our last odd year election, we were one of 2 cities that did the election in a couple of school districts, and our bill came in at 3 times as much as projected. So if I'm remembering correctly, it was around $300,000.
I would comment, however, that in 2022 there will be our next regular. There will be other elections, including congressional seats and those types of things.
In 2022, that's right. But if you wanted to do something in 2021, that would be very prohibitive.
Can I ask attendees to mute yourselves if you're not giving public comment? Thanks. Amarantz, you're muted. I'm going to go to Rick, who had something to follow up on that.
Yeah, I actually want to go back to Sean's comments earlier, where he stated that somebody had requested a change in the language. So a couple of questions. Sean, could you please let me know who actually wrote the language in the first place? And was it written by a neutral party, or how does that come about?
It was written by me.
Okay. And so when you got the request, I guess you said earlier today, to look at changing the language around, and I'm interested, was it from a proponent of one measure or the other, somebody who had, maybe a dog in the race, or a neutral party, or?
It was a proponent of the SMRG measure.
Okay. Thank you. Can you tell us who?
If you'd like me to.
Yes.
It was Karen Harrell.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, could you go over that again, the whole wording change again, Sean? Because that kind of went by really fast. That was the first I saw it, and I'm not quite sure I understood it.
Sure. So the ballot question for the SMRG measure has been drafted. It was in the resolution that the council adopted in May.
Could you, Sean, I'm sorry, could you show it while you're talking about it?
That would take an act of Congress, I believe.
Okay. Sorry.
A minor miracle, giving my skills. But so the first in the first 2 or 3 lines of text is almost word for word with the way the question is drafted in the resolution in the packet, and that's because it is essentially doing the same thing for most of the territory in the community, right? It's freezing heights and densities for 10 years, and so the request was, that's kind of confusing. People will get confused. And so why not change it a little bit so that the first thing that appears is the general plan will be amended to authorize the council to approve higher heights and densities. And then the other things that the measure does follows that text. And so that's the change. And I said, Neither way is illegal. I'll present it to the council, and it'll be the council's choice as to what they want to do.
Thank you.
Okay, other questions or comments from council members? Councilmember Lee.
I just wanted to ask one more clarifying question. From Sean, from your perspective, from a legal perspective, do you feel like the argument holds that it would have been against or contrary to the county health orders of sheltering in place to actually do signature collection?
Yes, I do.
Okay, thank you for that question. Eric, you had another follow-up?
It's not a follow-up question. It's an entirely new question.
Okay.
And this is probably for planning staff. When I was reading the alternative measure, I saw a date in there. I believe it was March 1st, 2023, as kind of like a date. Whereas if we haven't completed the general plan, that this measure would go into effect. And that was a pre-COVID-19 crisis. So I'm just curious, is it staff's opinion that still is a reasonable date that gives enough buffer where we're not going to be kind of running around really quickly to get it done before that date?
I can answer that question. So at this point, we are looking at more of a December 2023 final for our general plan update process. So no, March would not be sufficient.
Thank you.
Okay. Rick.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So the language change is new, and I was not that familiar with what is said initially, and I only got a brief look at what Sean showed us a little while ago. I'm thinking that the language change is separate and different than deciding to put it on the ballot. Is that correct, Sean?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so if the council decided it wanted to have time to review the language before deciding to change it, could we do that, Sean?
Yes.
Okay. Well, that would be my recommendation, actually, as we go forward with whatever other thing we decide to do, that if we do get to this point, we should consider holding off and take a closer look at the language rather than just the snippet we saw there for a second.
Okay. I want to contribute a couple of thoughts. First, in my approach to this whole issue, my first thought this year was this is not a great time for us to be doing this. It's really hard to do outreach to the community during this time. There's lots of people who are going to want to go out and knock on doors. And because of COVID-19, that's just not a good idea for anybody who has any opinion on any of these things, whether it's for Measure P or this alternative, or people who don't think that we should be voting for either one of them. It's going to be much harder to do the outreach. And so my initial thought was this isn't the year to be doing any of this. That ship has sailed. Measure P is on the ballot. We have our survey data, which shows us that in many respects, people are all over the map. People care about two things. They care about affordable housing. They know that we still need affordable housing. They care about traffic. I said it back in 2018, and I'll say it again, that the most important places to place housing in order to address traffic is close to the train stations. It seems to me that the maps we've been presented in this alternative measure places the study areas within half a mile of the train stations. That's one way of doing this. What's left out of this measure would be Bridgepoint. Bridgepoint seems to be a key study area when it comes to solving the traffic issues, since so much of our traffic comes from the East Bay. People coming over the San Mateo Bridge could get off the freeway and stay at the Bridgepoint center, whether it becomes housing or office or any kind of development. It seems like Bridgepoint is critical to addressing the traffic. So that's one of the areas that could be added to this. Beyond that, and I've looked at the study areas for our general plan, and I've looked at the study areas from this alternative measure that we're looking at tonight. The study areas that are not included in the alternative measure seem to be redevelopments that are currently 1 story or 2 stories. And even if they were redeveloped into mixed use developments, they would be adding a significant amount of housing in an area that is not immediately adjacent to a train station. And so by not including them, we are imposing, or people who would be voting for the alternative would be imposing the Measure P heights and densities on those study areas that are not as close to train stations. That seems to me what we're doing here, or what is proposed. Are there any feelings on whether we should change the maps at all in what we're going to place on the ballot? Councilmember Lee?
I also share the concern about the exclusion of Bridgepoint, and got a little bit nerdy with Rich about this today. I just think it's worth mentioning some of the key takeaways, and Rich, jump in if I get any of this wrong. But quarter over quarter, we're seeing a 3 to 4% increase in restaurant and food services revenue, and a decrease in of 1 to 2% in retail. We know that brick and mortar's future is very uncertain. That has a direct impact on our budget, and to exclude Bridgepoint from conversation and figuring out what the next evolution of Bridgepoint should be I believe will have a detrimental impact on our city's finances. And I can't support a path forward that excludes us from even considering those potential options. So I really feel like if we are going to consider an alternative, that Bridgepoint needs to be part of that conversation. And I think that there's a very strong financial justification for that to happen. And Rich, I don't know if you want to chime in at all about the fiscal impacts here.
Thank you, Councilmember Lee. The only thing I'll add are 2 things. One is a reminder that sales tax is the city's number 2 tax revenue source, and 2, a metric that Drew and I have been keeping track of for quite some time is that sales tax has not even kept pace with inflation. So if you simply apply CPI to our sales tax base going back to 2007, it has just not kept pace with it. And it's really big. One of the main reasons why is this change in consumer behavior of purchasing goods through online commerce rather as opposed to brick and mortar stores. So I appreciate your comments, Councilmember Lee. Thank you.
Thank you, Finance Director Lee. I don't think this conversation translates to anybody. I'm going to go to Councilmember Pappen in 1 second. I just wanted to piggyback on that. I think most people sitting at home really don't appreciate when we start talking about these incremental changes in the revenue streams that we get as a city. It just, in many ways, it doesn't matter. The things that translate for residents at home is, are you creating more traffic or are you solving traffic? My instinct is to include Bridgepoint because of its location close to the San Mateo Bridge, and that if it is going to divert traffic that would otherwise come to downtown San Mateo or would otherwise come to 92 and 101, that's something that seriously needs to be considered. And I'd like to see a traffic study in whatever redevelopment happens there that shows that it reduces the number of cars that make it to downtown San Mateo or make it to 101. Councilmember Pappen?
I don't have any questions to follow on with that.
Take us in a different direction.
Well, for me, I think putting this measure on the ballot, if you want to add Bridgepoint, I'm okay with taking Bridgepoint into account. I want to get to this idea of putting the measure on the ballot and what that means. And for me, it's about equality of process. And I don't think anyone predicted that there would be a pandemic. And so I think that if you do not allow this alternative measure on the ballot, you're really restricting discourse. And it was unanticipated that this discourse would be restricted in the fashion it's been restricted by. We know that our polling, as you mentioned, people are very, very focused on affordable housing and how we make that happen. And I think that there are many different ways to look at it. And I think it's important that we allow discourse to determine how we handle that affordable housing quotient and how we maybe continue to maintain the character of our city and still allow for that affordable housing quotient. So for me, it's about discourse and it's about equality of process. And I think with this pandemic, that hasn't been allowed. And so I am okay with putting an alternative measure on the ballot. If you want to add Bridgepoint, I'm okay with that, to explore Bridgepoint. Bridgepoint has its own set of issues, certainly with its ingress and egress and a lot of other issues with it, but it's a big plot of land, certainly, and retail is dying. So I'm certainly okay with looking at it. That's where I'm coming from on an alternative measure and putting it on a ballot.
Fairness and choice. I appreciate that as well. Other council members feeling on Bridgepoint, I guess, specifically, and then what direction we're headed in on whether to place this on the ballot. Councilmember Bonilla.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think I would agree, since so many other council members are interested in looking at Bridgepoint. I think it is a retail area that has been suffering of late, and to be able to develop some other plan that may allow it to be successful in the future, especially whatever. It needs to be studied and considered. I think adding it to this measure would be helpful. Also, I do support adding the alternative measure to the ballot. That's it. Thanks.
Okay. Councilmember Rodriguez.
Okay. So I'm just going to go through all my comments and they'll incorporate how I feel about the adding Bridgepoint, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So these are going to be a little bit lengthy because I think it's really important to explain. I think it's important that we all explain our thought process here, but I think for me especially, I really wanted to be thoughtful in how I approach this. In 2018, though my views were in the minority of the council, I supported a compromise with SMERG to place their measure on the ballot that year, even though I personally did not support the measure myself. And I supported it for two reasons. I felt that to help the proponents of the measure overcome a potential legal technicality was the right thing to do. And it would honor the will of a large segment of San Mateo voters. And number two, I thought that voters should have the final say on this important matter. And I had faith that the voters would ultimately make the right decision, whatever it was. Now, this evening, we have a situation that I feel is very similar, and the proponents of the alternative measure were well on their way towards collecting the requisite number of signatures until COVID-19 stopped them in their tracks. And while I understand that many disagree, I have little reason to doubt that this group would have been able to collect the requisite number of signatures. If COVID never materialized, I think we would not be here discussing this at all this evening. So as was in the case in 2018, placing this measure on the ballot would honor the preference of many San Mateans, and many of whom reached out to me who want a chance to vote on an alternative option. What makes this decision difficult for me personally is that I acknowledge that if we were to help one group tonight, when we as a whole voted to not help another group 2 years ago, this gives the appearance of lack of fairness. I get that, and I acknowledge that. But in spite of some reservations concerning overall fairness, I came into this evening compelled to vote in favor of placing this measure on the ballot. But I guess what is throwing me off here is that I have serious reservations with this council changing the measure significantly. If we start changing it, it becomes like our measure. And when it becomes our measure and we haven't done any prior public outreach, we haven't done any impact studies, we haven't done anything. This is like changing these maps have been the first time anybody's been able to see this. And we're kind of in a rush to do it now this summer. That kind of tips the scales for me. So I think that I would be in favor of putting it on as is, but if we start changing the maps, unfortunately, I don't think I'm going to be able to support it. Those are my comments.
Okay. So what I hear is, and I'm on the fence. I can go either way. So if we include Bridgepoint, I would include it for the traffic reasons. If we exclude Bridgepoint, and Bridgepoint is one of the study areas in the maps for the general plan. That's the initial justification for adding it. And since we're placing it on the ballot, we have that option of adding it if we choose to. My justification was adding it for traffic, which I think is borne out by the same survey that we are using to talk about to say that people support this. So number one, there is significant support for allowing for housing. And to me, this is less about heights and more about density. I think I've said in the past, it's the density in Measure P that is so difficult for me. Even if we wanted heights to be imposed, 50 units per acre is challenging and limits the amount of affordable housing that can be built on certain projects. But with that being said, I can go either way on Bridgepoint. I know Councilmember Lee has a very different view and justification for it. There's some question about whether we want this, whether we want this to be unanimous or whether we need Bridgepoint to be included. Anyone else? Kohar,
yes.
CDD Director Kajayan, go ahead.
I just wanted to provide some clarification. Not including Bridgepoint doesn't preclude any change from happening at Bridgepoint. There still could be change occurring. It just has to be within Measure P limits. So we could still take a look at various land uses and different types of land use and density at the site, but it has just to be within Measure P. So I don't want you to think of it as no change could occur. Change could still occur, and we would still analyze change just within Measure P limits.
I think that's a great point, and I think that the other areas, the 42nd Avenue Shopping Center, Norfolk and 92, those kinds of areas are areas that are not close to public transit, not close to the train stations, but are going to be redeveloped because of the retail that is currently there. It is very likely that it's going to face redevelopment, but Bridgepoint stuck out to me because of the traffic issue. I can go either way. Councilmember Pappen?
Yeah, I think taking the measure in its current form is truly somebody else's alternative measure. And, you know, my thought process was I'm doing this because it was difficult in a pandemic to allow the process to be equal. So I think I'm concurring with Councilmember Rodriguez. I don't think we should be then creating it and making it our own. It's intellectually sort of consistent to say that this is somebody else's measure. Pandemic prevented them from getting the signatures. So for me, it's about the equality of the process, and I'm leaning that way, just so you know.
Okay. Go ahead, Councilmember Bonilla.
After hearing foregoing discussion here, I'm beginning to have a little more respect for the idea that it is the alternative measures proponents measure, and don't want to change the language. Maybe Bridgepoint could be handled the way Kohar described. I agree with you a lot, Mr. Mayor, about the density being a real issue in Measure P. I know we could easily accommodate double the density in many of the buildings that we're looking at and that we will look at in the future without any major issues of congestion. All these things can be dealt with if we locate our projects, wisely and provide mitigations. So those are my thoughts. I support putting it on the ballot as is.
Okay, I'll take that as a motion as is then.
Yes.
And city attorney, could you clarify for us tonight? We are calling for the election and placing it on the ballot. So this is our vote.
You can do that. That's right. It's on the.
It's been
you have
noticed in that way.
That's correct.
So we have a motion to do that.
I would ask for direction on the ballot question. We can do that separately, just to get this out of the way, and then deal with the language of the ballot question.
Okay, we'll do that second, assuming we're placing something on the ballot. We'll figure out what that is. Okay, we have a motion to place it on the ballot as is, nothing else added. I'll second. Okay, Eric and I are both seconding. So with motion to second, Madam Clerk, would you call roll?
Councilmember Bonilla.
Yes.
Deputy Mayor Rodriguez.
Yes.
Councilmember Lee.
Yes, with very strong reservation.
Councilmember Pappen.
Yes.
Mayor Goethals.
Yes. So we're going to place this measure on the ballot. Now let's talk about the language of the question.
Mr. Mayor, I can bring that up if you'd like.
That would be much easier.
This one doesn't require the act of Congress?
Right. And so where you see the italicized text, that text was already in the language of the question. It just followed to extend for 10 years the expiration date for voter enacted policies. So the text that was in the resolution in the packet reads, shall the proposed ordinance to amend the City of San Mateo General Plan to extend for 10 years the expiration date for voter enacted policies limiting building heights, et cetera. Then it goes to, but to authorize the council to approve increases in height and intensities in designated areas. So that's the difference. We've flipped the extending for 10 years, the expiration date, with authorize the city council to approve increases in building heights and densities in designated areas that are close to major transit. And again, the rationale for the request was, as written, where it's flipped, the first three lines of this question in the ballot are the same as the first three lines in the SMRG measure.
That's accurate in terms of the action that's being taken.
That's right.
I don't have any problem with it the way that you had it originally. They still say the exact same thing. It's what order the clauses in the sentence appear.
Right.
And with regards to their effect on our general plan, we're not approving or the alternative here. This proposed ballot measure doesn't approve increased heights and densities. In effect, it is a restriction. Our general plan process is what will allow the zoning for heights and densities in those study areas. I like it better the original way, but other council members have opinions?
And if you if you want to see how it appears the other way, it's in the packet. It's the resolution in your packet.
Okay.
And I can try to pull that one up.
So let's call them the packet version or the amended version. Councilmember Rodriguez, do you have a preference?
I just got a question. I don't even know if this question makes sense, but is this kind of like an official SMERG request that they're trying to, make the comparison more fair, or is this just, one person's opinion email that's sent you?
It was a phone conversation, and it was just that request. It wasn't something official on behalf of the group. It was a request, the concern that, again, the rationale was that it might confuse folks, and that because they see this first several sentences or the first several lines of text are the same, they was like, well, I'm not sure which one to vote for. They might get confused and vote for something they didn't intend to vote for.
Because for me, I'm having trouble figuring out the difference. I agree with the mayor in that regard, but just again, out of fairness, I would be inclined to go with the one that SMERG favors, just because I think they say the same thing. And if they think it's slightly more fair, then I'm okay to go with that. I don't feel that strongly about it because I still don't see the difference that well. I think I got to look at it, I think, on my own, but I would be inclined to just say if that's what they want and they think it's going to be more fair that way, then that's the least we can do, I think.
Anybody else?
Can we go back to the slide that it is articulating what is being decided tonight?
Maybe. Do you see that? You see that now?
Yes.
So these are the questions that the council is asked to decide tonight. The council has answered the first, and so we are at the second question.
And I think based on what is that third question, Sean?
The third is if the council didn't want to do the first two, wanted to do something completely different.
Okay. I don't hear anyone asking for that at this time. With regards to question number 2, I think it's fair to say we could punt this until July if people want to punt until July to talk about the language. I have a preference for the language from our packet. I think it's more accurate as to what it does. The effect of this is to limit heights and densities in all the areas except for the carve-outs. Anyone else have a strong preference? Anyone else feel the need to work on the language and come back in July?
I'm good with that, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, you're good with the language from the packet, is that right, Rick?
No, I'm good with pushing it to July to make sure we get what we want. It takes some time to study the question.
I concur with it.
Okay, anyone else? Yes, Councilmember Pappen, you're okay with that? Sure. Okay.
I kind of feel like if we're not going to change things, then we shouldn't change things. you really want to know the truth. That's sort of where I'm headed.
Okay.
I'm happy to take some time to take a look at it. I found it in the packet.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I don't see it. But
the packet, I was fine with the way it was in the packet. We can think about it some more, talk about it some more. City Attorney Mason, any issue with coming back in July to determine the language?
No, that would be fine.
Could we also notice it in July for possibly voting to take action either to support or oppose this measure?
Yes.
We can do both of those things at our meeting in July.
Yes.
Is that the will of the council? Not head nodding? Yes, yes, yes. Okay. Okay. So then I think that's all we have on this item. Thank you so much. We have one more study session. Item number 3, general plan update. I believe we're going to CDD Director Kohar Kajayan or City Manager Drew Corbett. CDD Director Kajayan, welcome again for our general plan update.
The item will be presented by Joanna Jensen, our PlaceWorks consultant working on the general plan update.
Welcome, Ms. Jansen. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Mayor Goethals and Council. I'm going to share my screen and give you a presentation. PowerPoint window is not showing up. Oh, here it is. No. Yes. Sorry about that.
We're seeing it now.
Great, thank you. Okay, thanks again for this opportunity. The first thing that we always do in the general plan presentations is remind ourselves of the vision statement. This vision statement was a collaborative effort by many members of the community and accepted by the council last spring, and we use it throughout our work to inform what we are doing and how we are doing it. This is the vision statement and the values that are guiding our work. And those values continue to guide our work during shelter in place. Obviously, shelter in place currently is preventing us from having large public gatherings, but that does not mean that anything has changed in our commitment to increasing the representation of underserved communities throughout the general plan update process, although it does, of course, add some complications. So as we come to you tonight with some questions about how to proceed, we just want to give you a quick update on the project status overall. Since we started the project in fall of 2018, we have held numerous community events of all different types, and we have collected thousands of comments over the course of those events in person, online, and in writing. And based on those comments and the full range of those comments, we created 3 draft alternatives to reflect the range of those of the input that we received. And those alternatives cover potential future land use scenarios, as well as potential future circulation scenarios for San Mateo. And they're organized around the 9 study areas that you saw on Director Kajayan's map in your earlier presentation. We were able to share those 3 alternatives at an open house that we held in person at College Park Elementary back in March, on March 3rd. And we have also posted them on the strivesanmateo.org website. And before we were hit by the pandemic, we had a plan of refining those 3 alternatives through a series of public meetings, a GPS general plan subcommittee meeting, planning commission and council meetings to ensure that we were arriving at a range of 3 alternatives that really accurately represented what the community and the council wanted us to study. But events have intervened in that plan, and we can't really proceed in the way that we had envisioned. So that's why we're here tonight, to offer you some options for moving forward and get your feedback. So specifically, of course, the complicating factors that we're looking at include the COVID-19 pandemic and public health orders that limit face-to-face community engagement of the type that we had really been heavily investing in up until March. In addition, as you've been discussing, the Measure P extension and potentially this other ballot measure that are on the ballot could affect the range of feasible alternatives by imposing height and density restrictions. Third, we are hoping that, or we had originally been hoping that the preferred alternative for the general plan update would be developed and considered and evaluated and in place before the city needs to make substantial progress on its next round of its housing element, because the general plan is really the city's long-term vision for 20 years out into the future, and the housing element works on a much shorter term of an 8-year cycle. So we wanted to have that long-range vision in place before the housing element cycle comes up. But the way that these complicating factors are delaying things, it's starting to become unclear whether or not we'll be able to achieve that. So when we consider all of those complicating factors, we came up with 3 options to present to you and explore. So briefly, these options are: 1, to resume the alternatives creation and evaluation process as soon as the council approves an updated outreach plan. My understanding is that we're anticipating being able to bring that before you in a meeting in July. So we would basically follow the same process that we had originally anticipated, but we would be doing those meetings virtually rather than in face-to-face. Secondly, we could expedite the alternatives creation and evaluation process. And that means we would kind of skip the additional open houses, the GPS meeting, PC meeting, et cetera, that we had planned. And we would check in with council to see, does this seem like the right 3 range of alternatives to evaluate? You could give us some direction on refinement, and then we would move forward with the evaluation. And thirdly, our recommended staff recommendation would be to pause the alternatives creation and evaluation process, given all of the different variables that are currently in play, until after the November 2020 election. And after the election, we would take stock of where we are, what the voters have expressed, and what that implies about the range of feasible alternatives that would make sense for the city to invest in considering for the alternatives that we evaluate for the general plan. So that is staff's recommendation. It's our feeling that the ballot, the various measures that at this point are anticipated to be on the ballot are so directly related to questions about land use and heights and densities that at this point, given the delays and given the difficulty of being able to create and evaluate the alternatives and present the results of that evaluation to the public in advance of the election, we should probably just wait and make sure that we're listening to the outcomes of the ballot measures in the fall before we invest in evaluating alternatives that may be invalidated as a result. I can speak more about the pros and cons of each one of these options if you're interested, but for now I will pause there.
Thank you, Ms. Jansen, for the presentation. And are there any questions from council members before we go to the attendees for public comment? I don't see any yet, so I'll go to the attendees for public comment. We have a public comment from call-in user 1. You are unmuted.
Hello?
Yes, go ahead.
Oh, great. This is Karen Harrell. I've
Hi,
heard
Karen.
my name mentioned several times this evening. And I'm calling in on this one and speaking on behalf of San Mateans for Responsive Government. And just to make it clear, for even though your other item is already over, I don't ever contact anybody on issues that aren't where I'm not speaking for San Mateans for Responsive Government. So there you go. Speaking for SMERG, I'd like to support the staff recommendation and your administrative staff report to pause the alternatives creation and evaluation process until the end of the year. While we support the conclusion, we also want to go on record with a different approach as to why this is desirable. I know some disagree with what we've said so often since 2018, but we do support a robust general plan process and do not feel that the election process and possible outcome will derail that. Extending Measure P continues a stable planning situation until the community can work out what future they want for our city. The problem right now is rather how successful trying to move forward in a time of so much uncertainty will be. Many, if asked what they want for their future years from now, will say they can't see their future next month, much less next year. The current upheavals also call into question how to collect and evaluate data everything is really open to question right now. And so for that reason, SMERG supports pausing the general plan process until at least the end of the year. And we appreciate your recognition of those concerns and consideration of that. Thank you.
Thank you for your public comment. And next speaker is Evelyn Stivers.
Hi, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak. Evelyn Stivers, Housing Leadership Council again. So we've been working with MTC and a number of other agencies on more inclusive ways to do planning online. So it's there's a lot of thinking around in the equity communities about how to make planning more inclusive. As I know, the City Council really made huge progress in making the comments a lot more inclusive towards the end, right before COVID, with the pop-ups and going to where people are. So there are some tools that all you need is a cell phone in order to participate. You wouldn't have to be available for a 2-hour meeting. You wouldn't have to, if you have childcare issues, if you're working multiple jobs, you would still be able to be an active participant. I would really like the council to keep an open mind about that. I think San Mateo could be one of the places that really helps create new, more inclusive planning and more equitable planning. But of course, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Evie. And Adam Lorraine.
Hello. Good evening, Council. Can you hear me? Yep, it looks like we're good. I just wanted to give maybe a quick residence reaction to this, as I haven't been able to really study the options and chew on them and think exactly what I might want the council to support. I think my initial reaction would just be to ask the council not to go with option 2. I think option 2 definitely seems not in the best interest of San Mateans and the process itself. I am also just kind of surprised that losing 3 months in this multi-year process has us considering an option 3, because to me, I think, we did know, of course, that this Measure P extension was going to be put on the ballot, from the initial restructuring of the multi-year process. So if those 3 months really are the difference, then I suppose option 3 is a viable option. It seemed to me that Ms. Stivers was leaning toward option 1. But I think rather than weigh in without having thought a little more about it, I'll just ask the council to please not choose option 2. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other members of the public, attendees, wishing to make public comment at this time? Seeing no other hands, I will close the public comment period and bring it back to the council. Any comments by the council? Everyone agree to item number 3? Should we let Rick talk first? Just kidding. Anybody have any comments other than let's go with item 3? Yes, Councilmember Lee?
I think that it makes sense to go with the strategy number 3, precisely I think this moment in this meeting is a great example of how challenging it is to reach people and to have people working with full information. We've had people call in and write in accusing the council of preventing Measure P from going forward on the ballot when we approved it to go on the ballot, and so this is so complicated. The decision points, the trade-offs, the context that's required, the data that needs to be considered is multi-layered and really deserves a lot of depth and conversation. And I don't see us really doing the process justice, given the constraints of COVID-19. And that's not without the incredible effort that we've made to go online, to utilize technology and to do virtual, civic engagement, accessibility. And we've certainly done that and gone above and beyond. But I think for the general plan process, recognizing the constraints that we're working with right now, and us all being so committed to the process being as complete and robust and meaningful as possible, pausing it makes a lot of sense.
I consider that a motion for number 3. Everybody agree with that? We don't need a formal vote on that. Everybody agrees? Yes?
I wanted to add a couple of comments, Mr. Mayor.
Go ahead, please. Councilmember Benet.
Thank you. So, I mean, this is not a matter that I take lightly, because it's going to have major impact on the future of our city. And I'm one of the people who was really making a lot of noise, asking for extensive outreach, foreign language speakers. And I have to say, staff has really stepped up, and when they were able to, done a great job doing what they did. I really appreciate the improvements that they made. But looking at the options, when I look at number 1, I really feel that I like it because it would provide for more public engagement. But then I look at the fact that we've been completely derailed by COVID-19, and we're not going to be able to deal with things if we go forward with that. Like, well, what happens if one or the other of the ballot measures pass, and what will that do to the process? So I don't think that's viable. I don't like number 2, because that would be the council owning the decision, everything. These are the alternatives, right? And I don't think that's fair to the people either. I support 3 because what COVID-19 has done to us, we need to be more careful. The election is rushing up on us. Okay, it's really only a few months away. And 3 does not waste staff time or money trying to do things that may be completely negated by the outcome of the election. So I'm in favor of waiting, see what the outcome of the election is, and then plotting a course forward from there. Number 3. Thanks.
Thank you for those reasons. This item actually goes hand in hand with something that I'm going to bring up later on, an urgency resolution that I'm going to ask people to look at regarding an injunction that's being sought to prevent ballots from being sent out to all California voters. We've seen some decisive action from our governor and from the legislature to ensure that we have a safe and secure election. We've seen elections across the country where people are afraid to go to the polls because of health concerns. We've seen people lining up with masks to try to exercise their right to vote. I'm going to ask us all to support a resolution that would support the governor's executive order to issue a ballot to all voters so that they can mail in their ballots, because it'll be much safer and more secure. And the current efforts in our court system to prevent that from happening should not be allowed. Anyway, with that being said, I think we all agree with Councilmember Lee's motion to go with item number 3, and I saw unanimous support for that. We don't need a formal vote on this item, so that is the end of our study session. We will be back on a different Zoom at 7 o'clock for our regularly scheduled meeting, which has a very full agenda. Thank you all very much. We are adjourned.